On a sweltering July afternoon in 2019, the tranquility of the small town of Willow Creek was shattered by a tragedy that would haunt its residents for years. At the center of the chaos were two neighbors whose fates became intertwined in a tale of betrayal and vengeance. Jake Miller, a 42-year-old real estate agent, was well liked in the community for his generosity and easygoing nature. A single father of two young children, he had moved to Willow Creek seeking a fresh start after the sudden death of his wife. His new life seemed to be on track. He threw himself into his work, trying to build a stable and comfortable home for his children. Next door lived Valerie Kane, a 38-year-old elementary school teacher, known for her warm smile and love of gardening. She had been married once, but the relationship ended disastrously, leaving her alone and quietly resentful of the lives she saw through the windows around her. To everyone else, Valerie seemed to be the perfect neighbor, friendly, involved, and generous with her time. But no one knew the storm brewing behind Valerie's eyes, especially when she saw Jake. At first, Valerie watched Jake from a distance. She admired his dedication to his kids, the way he maintained his home, and the fact that he seemed untouched by the tragedies that had scarred her. One day, under the guise of a friendly chat, she approached him while he was mowing his lawn. Their small talk quickly grew into something deeper. Jake, lonely after his wife's death, welcomed the attention. For Valerie, it felt like fate. Over the next few months, their friendship blossomed. They spent more time together, sharing dinners, discussing their lives, and slowly letting their guard down. Valerie began to hope that Jake might be the answer to the loneliness that plagued her days and haunted her nights. But Jake didn't see Valerie in the same light. He liked her well enough, but his feelings were purely platonic. When Valerie hinted at something more, Jake, sensing the dangerous undercurrent, pulled back, trying to create some distance. Valerie, however, misread his hesitation as a sign of fear rather than rejection. She convinced herself that he was simply scared to move on after his wife's death. One evening, Jake brought a woman home. Valerie saw them through the window, laughing and clearly enjoying each other's company. Something inside her snapped. The rejection she thought was only temporary now felt like a deliberate and personal betrayal. The following days were a blur for Valerie. Her thoughts grew darker, consumed by an obsession to make Jake understand the pain he had caused. She started making anonymous phone calls to Jake's office, spreading rumors about his integrity, and leaving ominous notes in his mailbox. Jake, noticing these odd occurrences, became concerned but never suspected his friendly neighbor. But Valerie's obsession was only growing. The thought of Jake moving on with someone else, leaving her behind, was unbearable. She felt as if she had invested too much of herself to let go now. On a particularly hot July evening, she saw Jake's new love interest arrive again. Valerie stood by her window, staring at the warm light pouring from Jake's living room, watching shadows dance on the walls as laughter filled the night air. That night, she made her decision. If Jake could not see her love, then he would feel it through her pain. The following evening, Valerie watched Jake leave for dinner with his children. She knew he would be gone for hours, plenty of time for what she had in mind. She crept over to his house, carrying a canister of gasoline, her hands trembling but her mind strangely calm. She poured the gasoline around the perimeter of the house, soaking the wooden porch, the flower beds Jake had planted with his kids, and the garage door. She paused for a moment, staring at the home that had once given her hope for something more, and then, without another thought, she struck a match. The fire spread quickly, fed by the dry summer air. Flames climbed the walls, devouring everything in their path. Valerie watched, feeling a sick sense of satisfaction as the fire roared to life, the orange glow reflecting in her eyes. The fire department arrived too late to save the house, and by the time Jake returned, his home was reduced to a smoldering ruin. Jake stood in shock, holding his children close, watching helplessly as the firefighters battled the remnants of the blaze. He never suspected Valerie, she was just the sweet neighbor who had always been kind to his kids. But the town was buzzing with rumors. People whispered about how Valerie had always seemed a bit too interested in Jake, how her demeanor had changed in the weeks leading up to the fire. Valerie was questioned, but there was no proof, just whispers and suspicions. She remained in Willow Creek, a constant, unsettling presence. Jake never found out who burned down his home, but he would never forget the cold gaze of his neighbor, watching from her window with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. And so, a legend was born in Willow Creek, a tale of love turned into obsession, of revenge that left only ashes behind. The townspeople still speak of it in hushed tones, a warning to be careful who you let into your heart and your home. Months passed in Willow Creek, and the charred skeleton of Jake's house remained an eerie reminder of the fire that had consumed more than just wood and brick. Though the town moved on, the whispers never quite died down. People avoided Valerie Kane now, crossing the street when they saw her coming. Her once warm and open demeanor had become closed and curt. She still kept her garden, but her smile was tighter, her eyes darker. Jake meanwhile struggled to rebuild. His insurance covered most of the damages, but the emotional scars were harder to heal. He had moved his children to a small rental on the other side of town and tried to restore some sense of normalcy to their lives. The fire had taken more than their home, it had taken their sense of safety. His kids woke up screaming in the middle of the night, and Jake himself couldn't sleep, tormented by thoughts of who could have done this to them. One afternoon, Jake decided to clear out what remained of the house. He sifted through the ashes, looking for anything that might have survived the blaze. It was then that he found it, a small charred object in the corner of what used to be the living room. He bent down, squinting through the soot and debris, and pulled it free. It was a scorched photo frame, its glass shattered but the picture within still recognizable. It was a photo of him and his wife from their last anniversary, taken just months before she died. Jake felt a lump in his throat as he stared at the image. The frame was scorched in a peculiar way, burned around the edges, but the center remained strangely untouched. That was when he noticed something else. There was a faint mark on the back of the frame, almost as if someone had scratched it with a key. He turned it over and saw what looked like the letter V. His heart skipped a beat. He remembered Valerie's neat handwriting, how she had once initialed a book she had lent him with the same flourish. A cold dread washed over him. Could it be? Jake knew he needed proof. He began to watch Valerie from a distance, quietly, carefully. He noticed how she seemed to linger by her windows, how she watched his rental house with a strange intensity. One evening, he saw her sitting in her garden, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a lantern. She was humming to herself, her fingers playing with something small, a lighter. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Jake decided it was time to confront her, but he knew he had to be careful. He didn't want to provoke her, not yet. He needed a plan, and he needed to find a way to get her to confess. A week later, Jake decided to pay Valerie a visit. He knocked on her door with a forced smile, carrying a bottle of wine. "Hey Valerie," he greeted her warmly. "I wanted to thank you for all the kindness you've shown me and the kids, especially after everything that's happened." Valerie hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing, but then she smiled and opened the door wider. "Of course, Jake. Come in." Inside, the house was meticulously tidy, every corner arranged with care. But Jake noticed something else. The smell of smoke still lingered faintly, as if it had soaked into the walls. They sat in her living room and Jake poured them both a glass of wine. As they talked, he steered the conversation towards the fire, watching her closely for any sign of unease. "Valerie," Jake said finally, his tone serious, "I've been thinking a lot about the fire. The police haven't found much, but I keep wondering who would do something like that. I mean, we never had any enemies." Valerie's smile faltered just a fraction. She took a sip of her wine, her gaze shifting slightly. "It's a tragedy, Jake. A real tragedy," she murmured, her voice tight. "But sometimes bad things happen to good people. You can't always find a reason." Jake nodded slowly. "Maybe," he said. "But I found something strange when I went through the ruins. A frame with a letter on it. Your initial, actually. V." The air between them seemed to freeze. Valerie's eyes widened for just a moment before she quickly composed herself. "That's just a coincidence," she said, but her voice had a slight tremor to it now. Jake leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "Is it Valerie? Is it really?" Valerie stood abruptly, knocking her glass over. "I think you should go, Jake," she said, her voice cold now. "I don't like where this conversation is headed." Jake didn't move. "Valerie, if you know something, anything at all, you need to tell me." She laughed, then a high, brittle sound. "What would I know, Jake? I'm just your friendly neighbor." Jake nodded, standing up slowly. "I thought so," he said quietly. "I guess I was wrong." But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something on the mantel, a box of matches with the logo of a local gas station. His heart pounded. He knew that station. It was far out of town, the kind of place you wouldn't go unless you had a reason. That night, Jake called the police again. He told them about the matches, the initial on the frame, the growing sense of dread. But without concrete evidence, there was nothing they could do. They needed a confession, a slip, something they could use. Valerie, meanwhile, was unraveling. She had hoped that the fire would be the end of it, that she could somehow force Jake to see her, to understand her pain. But instead, it had only pushed him further away, and now he was suspicious. She could feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting. She began to imagine he was everywhere, whispering to the neighbors, turning them against her. One night, unable to sleep, Valerie found herself back at Jake's burned house. She wandered through the wreckage, feeling a strange mix of triumph and fear. She didn't hear Jake approach until he was right behind her. "Why, Valerie?" he asked softly, and she jumped, spinning around. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, fear and anger flashing in her eyes. Jake took a step closer, his voice calm. "Why did you do it? Was it because I didn't love you back? Or was it something more?" Valerie's face twisted with rage. "You don't know anything," she shouted. "I gave you everything. I was there for you and you threw it away just like everyone else." Jake took another step forward. "I'm sorry, Valerie. I'm sorry you felt that way. But you can't keep running from what you've done." Valerie backed away, her eyes wild. "You think you're better than me?" she spat. "You think you're innocent?" Before Jake could respond, she pulled something from her pocket. A lighter. She flicked it once, twice, then held it out, a small, menacing flame dancing in the darkness. "I'll burn it all down," she whispered. "Everything." Jake's heart raced. He knew he had to keep her talking. Valerie put it down. "This isn't going to solve anything." But Valerie was beyond reason. She looked around at the ruins of his home, her expression a mix of grief and defiance. "Maybe not," she said quietly. "But at least you'll know how it feels." She hurled the lighter into a pile of debris. Flames shot up immediately, hungry and bright. Jake lunged forward, grabbing her arm, but she twisted away, laughing wildly. As the fire roared around them, Jake dragged Valerie away from the blaze, holding her tightly as she struggled. "Let go," she screamed. "Let me go." But Jake held on, refusing to let her slip away again. The fire department arrived just in time, and Valerie was taken into custody, her face still contorted with rage. The truth came out in the days that followed. Valerie confessed to everything: the fire, the torment, her obsession with Jake. In her mind, she had convinced herself that if she couldn't have his love, then no one should. Jake watched as she was led away, her face expressionless now, her eyes empty. The town buzzed with the news, and the legend of Valerie Kane grew. People spoke of her in hushed tones: the neighbor who burned down a house for love, the woman who turned a quiet street into a scene from a nightmare. And though Jake and his children slowly rebuilt their lives, the scars remained, a reminder that sometimes the people who seem the closest can be the most dangerous of all. Months turned into years, and Willow Creek tried its best to move on from the trauma of that fateful summer. The remnants of Jake Miller's burned-down home were eventually cleared away, and a new house began to rise in its place. Yet, the memory of what had happened lingered, casting a long, dark shadow over the community. Jake did his best to rebuild, not just his home but his life. He moved his children back to their newly rebuilt house, determined to create new memories to erase the painful ones. He focused on his work, tried to smile more, tried to forget. But at night, when the town was quiet, he could still hear the distant crackle of flames, feel the weight of Valerie's words echoing in his mind. Valerie Kane was sent to a psychiatric facility rather than a traditional prison. Her mental health evaluation revealed severe personality disorders, compounded by years of untreated trauma. She became a specter in the minds of the townspeople, a ghostly figure who had lost herself in an obsession so deep that it consumed her whole. She was kept away from Willow Creek, locked away behind thick walls and guarded doors. But the legend of her rage was not so easily confined. Jake had tried to visit Valerie once, thinking that closure might help him move on. But when he saw her through the thick glass of the visitor's room, staring blankly ahead, muttering to herself, he felt only a chill run down his spine. She didn't recognize him, didn't even seem to see him. Her once sharp eyes were now hollow, lost in a world of her own making. He left the facility that day with a heavy heart, understanding that Valerie was gone in every way that mattered. But the peace he sought never fully returned. Unsettling things began to happen around his new home. It started small: objects would be moved when no one was around. Lights flickered despite new bulbs and rewiring. The children would wake up in the middle of the night, saying they heard whispering coming from the backyard. Jake dismissed it as the normal fears of kids who had been through too much. But deep down he felt the unease growing. Then one night, Jake woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. He got out of bed, heart pounding, and peered through the window. For a moment he saw nothing. Then, in the dim light of the porch lamp, he caught a glimpse of a figure standing just outside his door. A woman, tall and thin, with her hair hanging over her face. His heart stopped. He blinked and the figure was gone. The next morning, Jake found a single matchstick on the porch, lying on top of a burned-out leaf. It was a message, a reminder. Valerie was locked away miles from Willow Creek, but somehow her presence seemed to linger. He called the police, but they found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there. Jake tried to convince himself it was his imagination, the lingering trauma playing tricks on his mind. But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching. As the days passed, the strange occurrences increased. The scent of smoke would sometimes fill a room with no explanation. His children complained of cold drafts, even in the height of summer. The whispers in the backyard grew louder, unintelligible but insistent. Jake began to wonder if the fire had somehow left a scar on the land itself, a curse that refused to be lifted. Desperate, he turned to the town's local historian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Parker who had lived in Willow Creek her entire life. She had seen the town through many changes and knew its every secret. Mrs. Parker listened patiently as Jake recounted his experiences. She nodded slowly, her face serious. "I've heard stories like this before," she said quietly. "This land, it has a history. There was another fire years ago, long before any of us were here. A farmhouse burned down, taking a whole family with it. They say the land is cursed, that it holds on to its pain. Fire calls to fire, you see." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? Are you saying Valerie was influenced?" Mrs. Parker gave a small, sad smile. "I'm saying that pain has a way of lingering. And some say those who are already broken, they're more susceptible to the call. Valerie might have been driven mad by her own heart, but maybe something else pushed her too." Jake left Mrs. Parker's house with more questions than answers. He didn't believe in curses or ghosts, but he couldn't deny that something was wrong. The sense of being watched, of being haunted, grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as he was putting his children to bed, his daughter Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, her eyes wide and scared, "the lady in the garden says she's sorry." Jake froze. "What lady, sweetheart?" "The one with the sad eyes," Lily said. "She says she didn't mean to burn our house." Jake's blood ran cold. "Lily, there's no lady in the garden. You must have been dreaming." Lily shook her head. "No, Daddy, she was there. She looked at me and said, 'Tell him I'm sorry.'" Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window watching the garden, waiting for a sign, a movement, anything that could explain what his daughter had seen. But the night passed quietly, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the summer breeze. The next morning he decided to confront it, whatever it was. He walked into the backyard, stood by the spot where Lily had pointed. "Valerie," he whispered, feeling foolish, "if you're here, if you're haunting us, you need to let us go. I'm sorry for everything that happened, but you need to find peace." For a moment nothing happened. The wind blew softly, the leaves rustling in response. Jake turned to leave, feeling a mix of relief and disappointment. But then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the wind. "Sorry?" He turned back sharply, his heart racing. But the garden was empty. The air felt different, lighter somehow. He didn't know if he had imagined it or if Valerie had heard him, but he hoped, he prayed, that whatever had been holding her here had finally let go. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences stopped. The whispers ceased, the scent of smoke disappeared, and Jake's children began to sleep peacefully again. The house, once a symbol of destruction, slowly became a home again. But every now and then, on a quiet night, Jake would step out into the garden, looking out over the darkened street, and wonder if somewhere out there Valerie was watching, no longer with anger but with a sadness that had finally found its peace. And in Willow Creek, the legend of Valerie Kane continued to grow, a ghost story told by the children, a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors, a reminder that some fires burn far longer than they should, and that sometimes the scars left behind are the hardest to heal. In the months following Valerie Kane's death, Willow Creek gradually returned to normal. Jake Miller focused on rebuilding his home and creating a stable life for his children. He tried to put the events behind him, the fire, Valerie's obsession, and her tragic end. Yet, moving on wasn't as easy as he had hoped. The memory of that summer lingered in the town's consciousness, and for Jake, it felt like an open wound that would never fully heal. At first, things were quiet. Jake and his children settled back into their routines. The new house felt both familiar and different, a blend of old memories and new beginnings. Jake poured himself into his work and focused on his children's well-being, making sure they felt safe and loved. But there were moments, especially late at night when the house was silent, that he couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't quite right. Then one evening Jake noticed his daughter Lily standing by the window staring out into the backyard. Her face was pale, her expression distant. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Jake asked, coming up behind her. Lily hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I thought I saw someone in the garden," she whispered, not taking her eyes off the window. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He peered outside, but there was nothing there except the shadows cast by the trees in the fading light. "There's no one there, Lily," he said gently. "It's just your imagination. No one is out there anymore." Lily nodded, but she didn't look convinced. "I know," she whispered. "But it felt like someone was watching." Jake tried to reassure her, but that night, he lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the house, every rustle of leaves outside. The wind howled softly, and for a moment he thought he heard a faint whisper, just at the edge of his hearing. He sat up, heart pounding, but the house was still and quiet. The days went by without incident, and Jake began to feel foolish for letting his imagination get the best of him. He started taking long walks around the neighborhood, talking to his neighbors, trying to reconnect with the community that had once felt like a refuge. People were friendly, but there was still an undercurrent of unease, as if everyone was waiting for something else to happen. One day, Jake decided to confront his lingering fears head-on. He drove to the psychiatric facility where Valerie had stayed. He knew she had been buried in a small, unmarked grave on the grounds. He wanted to see it to find some sense of closure. When he arrived, the facility director, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, seemed surprised to see him. "I wasn't expecting any visitors for Valerie," the director said, glancing at his clipboard. "She didn't have many people come by. I wanted to see where she's buried," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I think it might help me put everything behind me." The director nodded slowly. "I understand. It's right this way." They walked in silence through the small cemetery on the property. The director finally stopped in front of a simple headstone marked only with Valerie's name and the dates of her birth and death. No inscription, no epitaph, just a stark reminder of a life that had gone tragically off course. Jake stared at the grave for a long time, his thoughts a jumble of memories and emotions. He thought about the woman who had been his neighbor, who had seemed so kind and normal at first. How had things gone so wrong? Could he have done something differently? "I'm sorry, Valerie," he murmured finally, his voice barely audible. "I wish things had turned out differently for you." He stood there for a while longer, then turned to leave. As he walked away, he felt a strange sense of peace, a realization that whatever had happened, it was over now. He had done what he could, and it was time to let go. Back in Willow Creek, life continued its slow march forward. The town began to forget, or at least to stop talking about, the events of that summer. Jake's children returned to their routines, their laughter slowly filling the new house with a warmth that had been missing for so long. Jake himself found solace in small things, working in his garden, cooking dinner with his kids, and spending quiet evenings on the porch. He knew there would always be a part of him that would wonder about Valerie Kane, about the choices she had made and the pain she must have felt. But he also knew that he couldn't live his life in the shadow of what had happened. Then one day a package arrived at Jake's door. It was from Valerie's estate, forwarded by the psychiatric facility. Inside he found a small leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with Valerie's handwriting, notes and reflections, some angry, some sad, some almost incoherent. As Jake read through the journal, he began to understand Valerie in a way he never had before. Her pain, her loneliness, and the way she had slowly unraveled. He realized that she had been more lost than he'd ever imagined, trapped in a darkness that no one had seen. Near the end of the journal, there was a final entry dated just a few days before her death. "I don't want to be angry anymore. I don't want to hurt anyone else. I hope he can forgive me. I hope I can forgive myself." Jake closed the journal, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew now that Valerie's actions had been a result of a deep, inescapable pain, a pain that had driven her to the edge. But in her final days she had found some small measure of peace, some understanding of her own torment. Jake put the journal away, deciding to keep it as a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the importance of compassion. He didn't know if he would ever fully forget what had happened, but he knew he could forgive. And so, Jake and his children continued their lives, with the scars of the past slowly fading. The house became a home again, filled with new memories, new hopes. The whispers and fears eventually disappeared, replaced by the sounds of everyday life. The story of Valerie Kane became just another tale in the history of Willow Creek, a cautionary story of what happens when pain goes unseen and untreated. But for Jake, it was a lesson in empathy and understanding, a reminder to always look a little deeper, to reach out a little more. And in time, the fire that had once destroyed so much became a distant memory, no longer a burning pain, but a quiet ember, glowing softly in the background of a life moving forward.